Oh, it's already on. Thank you very much. So if you want to do the organic amendments session, please stay. If you don't want to do that session, please move. But we would like to have as many people here as possible. So please stay for the organic amendment session if you're going to get going in a minute. It's very disconcerting that you're all sitting such a long way away. I don't know if that's because you are all socially distant. If somebody wants to move further, I think that would be lovely. Because it just, although I know you can hear me, it just feels that you're a very long way away. Sorry? Oh, I see. Okay, all right. So we are now going to have some real quality time talking about organic amendments, and we're going to talk about improving soil health and reducing tillage using compost and wood chips, different types of compost and wood chips. I think the session has been built talking about amendments and cover crops. We weren't, in fact, going to talk too much about cover crops, but if you have a absolutely burning ambition to discuss cover crops, we can do that in the question time afterwards. And we've got three speakers: Adam Raine, Sylvia Travers, and Ben Raskin, who are going to talk about different types of organic amendments and different situations in which they are used. I didn't actually start by introducing myself, which perhaps I should do. So I'm Margie Lennartson. I work at the Centre for Agricultural Water and Resilience at Coventry University. And to me, discussing organic amendments is certainly a great pleasure, a subject that I have worked on for very many years. But without further ado, let's get going. So we've first got Adam Raine, and each of the speakers is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will have an open discussion. We can have some questions after each one if there are any specific questions, but then try to leave as much time as we can for some open discussion later on. So Adam, please take the stage. So Adam comes here from Manchester. He was involved in setting up Gleveland City Farms, or Gleveland City Growers, a 2.7 acre market garden in Sale here in Manchester. And they started setting that up in 2009. So over the last 12 years, he's been supplying vegetables to different sources, to Unicorn Grocery, to weekly boxes supplied by the veg box people, and to Organic North wholesalers based in with New Smithfield Market. This year, in 2021, they've actually passed the market garden on to a former member of the team, who is continuing in the tradition of selling or providing fresh produce to shops, restaurants, and caterers. And Adam himself has moved on to working with the Kindling Trust, helping to develop their agroforestry and farm start site. And he will talk about using compost within a minimal till system. Please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thanks for that introduction. Nice to be here. So as you've just been introduced, my name is Adam Raine. I worked for 12 years on Gleveland's. I helped manage that site, which is 1.5 miles that way. So it's very, very close to here. Specialised in salad crops and leafy greens. And Dan Lark and the amazing team are doing a tour round tomorrow on the site. It's currently managed by them. And they're going to do a great tour. No pressure, Dan. I'm here to talk about my experiences of using compost on that site. I will hopefully get on. So lots of salads and leafy crops, as I mentioned before. So I'll just whiz past that. So manures were used heavily on the site from 2000 to 2012, and they were the primary applications used with tractor, link box, which is a small tractor, which you can see on there. That's what it was used, the rotavator that turned the manures in, and there was a flail mower which was used to sort of turn the crops in. So So yeah, that's what was happening at that point. As much as it did work, we felt these issues couldn't be ignored when we were using the manures though. We did have weed seeds arriving on site, new weed seeds, a lot of couch was coming in as well. Each batches were different, so that was really hard to gauge how much to put on. We had concerns about herbicides that were getting used around the piles, which we spotted on one occasion, and that stressed us out. It's heavier and bulkier than the compost to apply. And we did have some concerns about heavy metals getting in on the muck as well. So we decided to sort of move away from manures. This was just our experience and our local supply, obviously. So we moved to using green waste compost, and we were using it from Fairfield, and it was quite a unique situation in that it was organic, certified green waste. It's not always the case. And this was made from veg waste, composted in New Smithfield Market, which is about 6 miles or so from here. And yeah, it was just a really great product for us. We started using that, applying it in the same ways with the tractor and turning it in with the rotavator. So we weren't at this point doing low-till methods, but the compost was working well for us. It was screened to 20 mil size. So it did work with the tractor in that situation. Unfortunately, they stopped providing compost, and then this is where I wanted to sort of talk about the sort of challenges of finding green waste compost and my experiences with that. So yeah, you can see here we were applying some, homemade compost actually, but the problems that we faced were basically just finding good, reliable green waste compost. I found to be really tricky. There's several different suppliers dropping it off. It was arriving in big, very woody. It's basically just like applying wood chip sometimes. And yeah, without the added security of having some homemade compost, we would have been in a tricky situation at this point. So it took quite a while to find a good source. The sort of sandy loam soil on the site, it really stands out when you're applying a compost which is low in nutrients, because it showed straight away, and we were having to apply chicken fertilizer to sort of remedy the poor compost that we were getting delivered. So after talking with a composting company called Freeland Horticulture in Doncaster, they sort of came to the rescue a little bit, and they talked through what they could offer. And it's a much finer sort of compost. So we started getting it delivered from Doncaster, which seems quite a way away. But they assured us it would be fit for purpose. And the interesting thing that I found about it is that they were talking about a consideration for market gardeners when buying green waste is the time of year to buy it. And they recommended buying it around this sort of time in autumn, and that's because the councils that are collecting a lot of the waste, it's often gathered during the summer months. A lot of green material is gathered in this period, so you end up with a much sort of suitable compost for horticulture, and if you're buying it in the autumn time. So they recommended doing that, and I'd never heard that before, and I found it was the first sort of yeah, it was just really useful, a bit of information to find out. They also did nutrient analysis. So I would recommend when looking for green waste compost, if a company can't provide nutrient analysis of their compost, get to be suspicious. A lot just have the sort of PAS 100 certificate, which is a sort of a minimum requirement. So we did get a picture of me celebrating with the compost when it arrived, jumping around in the pile. So excited after getting lots of bad stuff. So yeah, it is just a bit of a lesson that to try and really research and try and spend time sourcing green waste, because there's such a scale I found in what it is, and yeah, during the seasons it varies massively. So don't just get to spring like I did and order some compost, because it's you could be left in a bit of a tricky spot. I've found that the darker the coloured green waste compost, the better that is suitable for market gardening. It's not massive in nitrogen levels, but it has a really good balance, so it's really good for long-term fertility building. If you're wanting to grow some of the more heavy nitrogen rich crops which need in that, then you might need to implement with other sort of feeds, but this seemed to work pretty good for our purposes. So as well as buying in green waste, the site has always made compost, and that's because we used, well, Dan still does, collects waste from Unicorn Grocery. There's a picture of it there, and that's a few miles down the road. Worth a drop in if no one's been there. It's a great shop. Very supportive, and all the veg that they buy in is organic. So Cleveland's deals with all their veg waste that comes out of there. So it's ideal for an organic certified holding like Cleveland's is, to be dealing with all the waste which is organic. So composting is done on site. That's the early stages of tinkering with compost in bays. Obviously it's smelly, moving bays and bays and bays over. It's quite labour intensive, lots of turning, a lot of rodents as well. So that is a problem that you get into with doing it open composting like this. So I wanted to talk about this sort of system that I sort of looked into to help with applications of compost. I looked into aerated static piles and enjoyed this sort of research. Visited Hankham on the south coast, who were doing aerated static piles. This was about 5-6 years ago. There wasn't tons of information on the internet for a small scale setup. So I had to sort of budget a little bit. There's a little bit more now, but the idea is that you're putting air with a blower like that into a compost pile, and you use a timer, and it sort of comes on at regular intervals, and you're introducing air to stop it becoming anaerobic. It's a very interesting, fascinating process to get involved in making it with this. And I'll just talk about how I sort of did it really. Using IBC tanks and pipes, feeding air in from a jacuzzi blower that I bought online, and I think the neighbours would have thought pretty bonkers. Basically lots of these tanks filled up, and we're adding wood chip at the bottom along the pipes and feeding air through, and then layering up the compost at a ratio of 4:1. 4 of the waste from Unicorn to 1 of some small processed material from Tree Station, so very fine shavings from their processing plant. It's very important that you get small stuff, in my opinion. I'll explain later. And add in a cup of chicken pellets for every time you do that as an activator. I found that is actually quite important. Trying to find alternatives if you don't want to use animal pellets, but something to activate it, I found is necessary. So the challenges that I got into were obviously, it's a complex. Doing a complex composting system as well as managing a farm, I found was difficult, and managing to do all those different aspects was tricky. Getting the temperatures right in a sort of quite a small contained site. Aiming for 65 degrees, I was more like hitting 55 degrees, so not quite as good as I was hoped. Obviously, the challenges of making your own compost are that it's a lot of work. So 2 to 3 hours a week spent on composting, picking up the waste, bringing it and doing it. It works out quite expensive. It's about 160 hours of labour a year making the compost, and we used to get about 6-ish tons of compost. So it's a bit of a labour of love in that sense. But when you end up with a problem, it's really good to have homemade compost on site. Is it worth it? I learned a lot from doing it. I think it's finding the correct system which works for the site. That we stopped using the aerated method after a while and was just using tipping of the bays into large holding bays and using worms as the main sort of composter. And it took a year instead of 3 or 4 months, but it got there, and we're very pleased with the compost that we ended up with. So I just wanted to talk a bit about minimal till working with the composts. So that's a bit of a picture with the pushing it. You can see the worms there in the compost. So yeah, we changed over to using a tractor. Started using minimal till. So we redesigned all the beds on the site and made them a lot smaller so we could use them with hand tools. We did this for a number of reasons, that we were concerned what the rotavator was doing over time. It's very sandy soil, and we were noticing it was sinking a bit, and when it was raining, we were losing a lot of the top layer. Obviously, it's very wet up here. So we went to the system to try and remedy some of the issues that we were seeing using the tractor. So we changed the beds, flipped all the beds around, and you can see that the compaction from the tractor going that way, and that actually took a few years to get rid of. We were like sort of hurdles in the crops where they were struggling to grow, but it pulled through that eventually. Yeah, we found that broad forking the beds and using a tilfer, which is a little battery powered device, is a really useful way of managing market garden with sandy soil. I might be a little bit nervous about doing it on heavier soils. You probably would need, I imagine, a lot more compost on top, but we found this method works quite well. It took a lot longer to get to where we wanted to be than I guess I'd thought we would do. It took about 5 years to make sure that the soil was loose using some of these methods. We're adding 2 minutes. Sorry, everyone. So you can get the idea a little bit from the pictures. Broad forks and a tilfer. So I think that the main sort of challenge that I find with trying to do minimal till system with compost and trying to make it work on a commercial site is keeping the soil loose on top, which is kind of important in order to make efficiencies with planting and direct seeding. It still does need that top bit of tilthing in my opinion, unless you're adding a lot of compost on. And we were sort of adding about a barrow of compost for a 50-foot bed, so it wasn't covering totally covering at all. Same sort of volumes as what we were doing with the tractor, but we just sort of took it to a no-dig, minimal till setup. So I'd say the tilfer is a very, very important bit of kit, and I think it'd be great if we could see somebody inventing a slightly bigger one, electric. I'd love to see that, and flail mower. I know there's not long left. I've gone over here. Sorry, everyone. Missed some significant bits. So the benefits that I saw to using compost in the low till method was a main advantage was the pH went up. It was always around 6. We had to lime every year, and with additions of compost, it now settling around 7. The site had never needed to add lime again, and it sort of settled at that amount, which I thought was pretty good. The structure did take longer, as I said, but it was after about 5 years, the structure of the soil is in a lot better shape than what it was before we were adding, before we adopted those practices. And just this year, talking with Dan and the other growers on site, they've been using experimenting and doing no broad forks on the beds, and noticing even better results, like more worms in the beds, which is good to see that it's getting there. But it has taken some time to get to this point, I think. So expect it's not a quick changeover in my experience, and that's with sandy. That's on a sandy loam soil. Yeah, I've had to rush through a bit there, so apologies. Anyway, thank you.
That's great. Has anybody got any sort of direct questions to the talk, matters of clarification or anything? Or should we move on and discuss it more later on? Okay, well, whilst you're all quiet, I think we'll move on then in the speed of time. So we've now got Sylvia Travers. Sylvia is a team leader of the inner walled garden at RHS Garden Bridgewater. Sylvia is, I understand it, originally a pomologist, or has got a PhD in pomology, but has also a long background in growing food for Michelin-starred chefs, and has worked at the RHS Garden Bridgewater since 2018, where she's been involved in creating a completely new kitchen garden. So having worked in different places, she has got a lot of experience of building kitchen gardens, basically on brownfield sites. And she will talk about two projects specifically, where she has been involved in the Northwest generating or regenerating damaged soil using mulch and no-dig principles. Over to you.
Hi, and thanks for having me. I feel you're going to take the scale down slightly now after Adam. So I'm going to talk about two projects I've worked on for the last 6 years of regenerating old wall gardens. So they're brownfield sites. They had old gardens in them. They had lots of vegetation, lots of old buildings, lots of tree stumps and things like that. So it's a case of stripping out an old garden and installing a new one, and the problems that come with massive soil movement and how to get your soil into good heart again using mulch after such invasive treatment. And I guess the two projects are very similar. So this seems to be my pattern in life now, going from one wall garden to another, in the sense that they're old Victorian sites with the sort of old saggy drainage that comes with them oftentimes, and in Bridgewater certainly contaminated soil from Victorian practices. Right, I'll just get started. So, contents of it. As I've just mentioned, some background of where I've come from. And the consequences, I think that's really important, that oftentimes when gardens are designed on such a large scale, the consequences of moving soil isn't thought about because the design and the build takes precedence. So that us horticulturalists at the very end of it are left with this area of land that we need to grow plants in and make a beautiful garden, and oftentimes we can't because the soil is really messed up from moving it. And I kind of was steered towards no-dig and using mushroom compost for this reason, really just to regenerate, as a way of quickly regenerating a site with a long-term view, but also allowing me to use the soil and to create a garden, because obviously I'm under pressure to grow crops and to get a garden open. So I'm going to talk about Moore Hall in Ormskirk. It's a 2 Michelin-star restaurant now. That's what I started with when I began. It was an old 5-acre estate with a manor house on and a lake. My first day was the top left picture. And the idea was to create a very nice, beautiful, productive kitchen garden that would supply the restaurant with microherbs, edible flowers, you name it. So downscaling a larger garden into about 1/3 of an acre, 1/4 of an acre, and making it incredibly efficient, beautiful, and growing vegetables with a microscope for the table. And that's what we ended up with once everything was stripped out. The level, you can just see, went down about 1/2 metre. We went down below the root level into subsoil. Outside the walls of this garden is beautiful West Lancashire black soil, which every farmer dreams of, and we took it away. So we had to start again. A lot of hard landscaping, a lot of MOT stone, and a lot of soil import. The levels were built up, built new glass houses, coal frames at the back, raised beds, and then just to the sort of left of the picture would be open beds for growing. This is how a lot of the soil was brought in. Great for efficiently moving tons of soil, but not great for structure. And it broke my heart to see beautiful soil being dumped in this way, but that's how it was done. And this is the consequence. And it's the same at Bridgewater actually, but I'll go on to that later. But you can see what I was left with. The soil was mixed with a bit of rubble or the subsoil. And the soil that was brought in was from the local area. It's brought in by a local company. Again, beautiful soil, but the structure was gone. It was like powder. Slightly acidic, beautiful loamy peat, but as soon as it rained, all the silt and sand puddled to the top, and it was like concrete. And then when it dried out, it was impossible. So you can see this is the garden set up as it is just after, it would have been the end of sort of 2016. You can see it all looks great, except for this little puddle in the middle. So bearing in mind a lot of good drainage was put in, land drains everywhere, we still had problems. The soil was just dead. There were no worms, there was nothing. I tried growing crops under this environmesh here. It didn't really work because the soil was dead. And you can see the first growing season, the difference. To the left, you can see things are growing normally. To the right, you can see things are a bit smaller, they're a bit chlorotic. The soil is very compacted. There's no air in it. There's no water retention. Plants can't get nutrient. I needed to find a way of making it productive because I was under pressure to grow. Even the weeds are better on the left. And again, it affected our germination. You can see that the top bit where that compacted mess was, there's no germination, and the rest is quite erratic for direct sown. So we decided to go down the no-dig route and the mulch route. The no-dig, I guess, because labour-wise, it was only me and Catherine in this whole garden, and it just meant that we could not have to do this job of digging the soil every season. Also bringing up weeds, you can see that there's quite a number of weeds in there. Bridgewater was even worse, which I'll show you. But it just meant that we could leave the soil to recover because it already had been turned enough. It had already had enough disturbance. I didn't really want to add to that, and also create pans and just make it worse. And we chose mushroom compost very much for the similar reasons that Adam explained about using green waste. We couldn't get enough decent quality green waste at the time. Bearing in mind we're in West Lancashire, there are an awful lot of mushroom growers in the area. There was a mushroom grower 10 miles away that could supply us consistently with mushroom compost from the one grower. And it was good stuff, it was cheap, it was readily available, and it meant that we could get up and running. And the soil here is mildly acidic. The mushroom compost just meant that it gave us bulk to grow in, it gave us a medium to work with because we couldn't actually direct sow into that soil. And mushroom compost itself is reasonably stable actually, and it's because it's been made to produce a very consistent crop of mushrooms. So bearing in mind it's got a level of nutrition, the mushrooms take out some of that as it grows. So when you get it as spent mushroom compost, then it's not as potent as you would imagine. It's water retentive because mushrooms like water. It's slow release and it's good bulk. And it actually, by the time you get it, it's really crumbly and broken down if it's good. And this is after our second season growing. Most of the problems are out of the way. And the other thing about mulching on top of this soil is that it gives you a buffer. So most annual vegetable crops grow in the first few inches of soil. They don't really get down below the mulch. And even on the hottest days, they'll go, and the dry weather, they'll go horizontal. They won't go vertical into the soil looking for nutrients and water. So it meant that even if the soil below wasn't great, the compost and the mulch above actually was enough to sustain a crop. And this is what it looked like looking up that really thick bed after the second season. There's still a few spots here and there, but it's by and large solved. Of course, it's a long-term process, and it's a system where you need a lot of input at the beginning, but actually as you go on and the soil recovers, the inputs decrease because we don't need to keep putting on that level of mulch every year. Some beds we don't even bother because there's enough there. The plants look good, the soil looks good. Some beds might need a bit more. So it's a bit of a empirical review every year to see how things are doing and look at crops. And I think sometimes we forget that aside from soil testing and looking at stuff scientifically, we need to actually observe what's going on. And sometimes looking at crops, looking at our pest and disease load is enough to tell us that actually things are okay. Right. That's just another last view. Right, this is the next one. I larged on this one. This is the first day I started at Bridgewater. The entire wall garden is 11 acres. The area I was responsible for building is 3.5 acres. It's the old Bridgewater estate, owned by the chap who built the Bridgewater Canal, which runs south of the site. You can see in the right of the picture is the remnants of an old espalier pear. You can just about see that its arms sticking out of the side. That was the only tree, apart from one acer, which is in the top left corner, in the entire area that was left. So during its various incarnations since the Duke of Bridgewater estate I was dissolved really after the Second World War. It had been used by the Scouts, it had been used by the as allotments during the Second World War, it had been used as by the army, and then it was used as a garden centre. So there are an awful lot of small saplings healed into the ground. These were left and they grew into big trees. So there was a massive amount of clearance. And as a result, again, a reduced level to about 1 metre. So we were right down to proper subsoil. And the garden borders Chat Moss, which is an area of peat bog, lowland peat bog, which is very fertile, very good, again, loamy peat soil, very spongy. And when the site soil report was done, it was stated that this soil structure is very delicate. You treat it with delicacy, you do not move it with heavy machinery, and you don't drive on it with machinery. So where the Bridgewater car park is now for the garden is where the soil for the kitchen garden came from. I mentioned about soil contamination. The Victorians were very fond of their chemicals, arsenic being one of them. So the soil in the kitchen garden, or what became the kitchen garden, which is here. So this area is about 1.5 acres. Had levels of arsenic that prohibited us growing in it. So this soil was scraped again, so another reduced level dig, bunded, and was then brought in to make the Paradise Garden because that's ornamental. There was something called an allotment test done, whereby you grow vegetables on this arsenic contaminated soil and you only eat them for whatever 4 months of the year, and then you accumulate and see how much arsenic you would potentially ingest. It was at the bottom end of the range, so theoretically it wouldn't have done us any harm, but we erred on the side of caution and put it into an ornamental garden. Therefore, we needed to bring in new soil to fill this. 99% of the soil for Bridgewater was won on site from various excavations. So as I said, Chat Moss, part of it, which became the car park, the soil from there was bunded to the top of the site for 1.5 years while the garden was being built. Anyway, this is what I started with. Again, another massive hard landscaping, drainage. I think it's an organic grower's nightmare, probably. It was a bit of mine, I can tell you. I can't even believe we did it, really. So it's a very unrealistic way of building generally, because the cost of bringing in that much of hard landscaping and drainage is huge. But it was the only way of getting this garden done, and essentially it was out of my control. This was all designed. I was the end user as the horticulturalist. So you can see the level of drainage, hard landscaping that went into it. And this is what we sort of ended up finished with. You can see, being a meadow, it wanted to return into a meadow, and this is what was left. All this soil has been leveled with an excavator. It looks lovely and fluffy and smooth and level, but it's like powder. And you can see already the couch coming up here, and there's 1.5 acres of this. Makes me shake just looking at it now. And this is the first summer, early last spring, just before COVID. This is what it looked like. So it was like this in the winter, really panned and horrible. In the summer, it went into clods like this. We tried digging it to see what would happen, and this is what we got. It was impossible. You couldn't break it down. So we decided to mulch. Again, it was the only way of doing it, really, feasibly for us. Because also bearing in mind the soil level was shrinking because it was settling as we go, because it was they'd fluffed the beds up so much, we ended up with about 6 inches of sinkage. We got cardboard from a local funeral directors, and bike shops, so we had a really good supply of it. We only used it just as a way of providing a buffer to suppress the couch a little bit. You don't need it, but it also meant that we could put less mulch on the beds on top. So we ended up putting probably about 2 to 3 inches of mushroom compost on here. And then COVID hit, so we couldn't open the garden anyway. We decided to give the beds to staff as staff allotments. to get them used, but also to give us a bit of something because we were working on our own. We were in split shifts. We didn't see each other much all over site. So it was a way of bringing us together. But it also meant that we could see were there any problems in the beds a year earlier before we actually opened. And you can see the cooch again. And this is this summer. So we've got lettuce growing, we've got the mushroom compost on the left. Looks chunky, but it's not. And if you scuffle beneath the soil, this is what you get. It's worked amazingly well with very few problems. And again, we had a few spots where the drainage wasn't quite working, there was a bit of compaction. Bearing in mind the subsoil here is Manchester marl. You know, that really big clay stuff you could build pots with. That's below, and inevitably that got mixed into the topsoil as well. So also by not digging it, we just left that be. And we had no worms at the beginning, lots of weeds. And then last year we also got massive amounts of flea beetle. I don't know if anyone got flea beetle last year. We got flea beetle on chard and on pear trees. I've never seen that before in my life. So this is my plot last summer. Things are going okay, you know, considering. And then this is just this summer gone. So some of the areas in the garden we didn't cultivate at all last year. We just left them. We just mulched them really thickly. They were particularly heavy and claggy, and we left them. And the worms have returned, and it looks really good. And this is one of the beds. So this is kind of like a deconstructed Three Sisters. So you've got the beans, the sweet corn, and the pumpkins, and some sunflowers there just for a bit of colour. So I suppose inevitably there are issues with using this type of method, that it's not something you would that's feasible for everybody. It tends to be used on a small scale, and it's really feasible for us in terms of just getting a garden started. It's a long-term project, and it's something that I want to move away from having such high inputs and making it more self-sustaining. So we're going to start producing our own compost on site. I'd love to use more green waste, but last year the supplier wouldn't sell it to us because it was so wet and anaerobic. Too much fertility is often cited as a reason for not using mushroom compost. I haven't found that so far in the years I've been using it. It's not particularly high in nitrogen mushroom compost once it's been spent, because some of it's been taken out. I find it very good, stable release, even though the soil we're working on is quite fertile. It didn't seem to have any problem in terms of excessive fertility. Time will tell though, but that's again another reason not to use it so excessively every year, year on year. High input costs. Mushroom compost is essentially a waste product. It's not without its own disadvantages in terms of how it's made and what goes into it. I'm aware of that, but as a waste product, it's a really useful thing. And actually, it's very cheap as a waste product as well. Scalability, again, depends what you want to invest in it. In terms of labor, I'd rather do that than dig. And we don't use any machinery. So whether you outlay on a machine or you use no dig, I mean, I guess it depends what you want to do. I know there are a few places that are using no dig and mulching, not necessarily mushroom compost, but on a larger scale. There's a place in Ireland, in Cork, who's using it. I know there's a few here too in the UK. The other thing that it's becoming hard to source mushroom compost now because of Brexit. So the grower that I would have used in West Lancashire has now moved to Poland because it's cheaper to produce mushrooms in Poland. So the supplier, the haulage company or the broker who I used to buy the compost from is now making his own because he's realized actually there's a huge demand for it. So he's getting a manure and straw and making his own because he's got the space and facility to do it. So there's another market springing up to fill that gap. And these, anyway, this is what I want. So we're getting fungi galore in the beds, the bird's nest fungi, and we're getting big fat juicy worms, and there's a lovely aeration hole up at the top there. And these are some winter lettuce that went in a few weeks ago, and you can see we're still getting mushrooms popping up in the soil. And from a public garden and an education point of view, it's a really useful tool seeing all these mushrooms and things, because people assume it's a bad thing to see mushrooms in their soil, but actually it's one of the things we all want, surely. Different type of mushroom though. And so I guess it's a feasible thing for a small amateur grower, but I also think some of it is feasible for a larger grower too. Anyway, thank you. So this is, when I was saying about roots growing sideways in the soil, this is a turnip from the summer of 2018, that really long hot one. And it was 18 inches long, that root, and it was horizontal, horizontal in the bed, and a small dog foot for scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celia. I think in terms of time, I think we're just going to move on, but we'll hopefully have time for some questions later on. That's all right. So Ben Raskin will speak as the last speaker. I'm sure you're all very aware who Ben is, perhaps, but just to say that he's the head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association, where he supports a network of growers and promotes organic principles and techniques. But alongside his role at Soil Association, he also does an awful lot of other things. I get tired of just reading it, basically. So he's a very prolific author, and I've just bought his new book on woodchip, which I think you should all look. I'm sure that will make really interesting bedside reading tonight. So I'm looking forward to that. So he writes lots of books, lots of children's books, really exciting books about different things. But alongside the book writing, he's also the co-chair of the DEFRA's Edible Horticultural Roundtable and on the board of the Organic Growers Alliance, as well as on the Community Supported Agricultural Network UK. And apart from that, he also project managed a 200-acre agroforestry planting in Wiltshire. So how on earth you have survived to be here, I don't know, but please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Well, of course, I wouldn't be anywhere else, would I? So, yes, that's me. And I thought I'd just big up a few other people, because I wouldn't have written the woodchip book if I hadn't got a bit inspired by quite a few other people on woodchip. So one of them is Ian Tolhurst, who has been doing quite a lot with woodchip over a number of years. Another is Sally Westerway, who used to work for the Organic Research Centre. I was involved in a 3-year project looking at Raymond Woodchip with her, so I'll talk a little bit about that. There's a chap called Glyn Percival, who's a tree scientist researcher, and we did a innovative farmers field lab with him looking at willow woodchip and the role of salicylic acid in stimulating immune reactions to tree disease. So lots of these things. Fred Bonestrew at Duchy Home Farm with his propagation, sort of using heat from woodchip to heat up propagation seedlings. So all of these things suddenly just made me think, my God, not really thinking about woodchip enough as a really sort of useful resource. You know, we can grow trees well in this country, but are we using the stuff that comes out of it well enough? So I'm going to talk a little bit about mulches, because I'm guessing that's sort of really where people have been thinking about using woodchip, and mostly people think about using it on paths. We've been using a lot on trees at Eastbrook Farm for mulching around trees, but there's also a role potentially in no-dig systems. I'm going to talk a bit about Raymond Woodchip, which is this very young woodchip, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the woodchip does when it sort of hits the soil, as it were. So, there's a whole range of effects that a mulch has. I don't need to sort of go into all of it in detail, but the sort of the obvious one is weed control. So a lot of people are using mulches to control weeds. There's various ways that woodchip will do that, and depends on the woodchip, and it depends on what weeds you're trying to control. So coarse woodchip is a great weed control mulch, because it's a material that when seeds land on, they won't germinate. It's coarse, it's dry, it dries out quickly, it drains quickly, they can't get their roots into anything quickly. So it prevents germination of new seeds. There's also quite a lot of woodchip has sort of allopathic properties that will inhibit seed germination. So as well as the physical property of a woodchip mulch, you've got potentially the chemical property as well. If you've got a well-rotted woodchip mulch, it will get absorbed quicker into the soil, so it has potentially a more immediate soil health benefit, but it also is a better place for seeds to germinate. So if you're using green waste compost, for instance, or a well-rotted woodchip, it's actually not quite so great, certainly for annual weed control, because you're effectively providing this lovely seed bed that everything can sort of come and germinate on. So understanding sort of what it is you're trying to control is useful. So as well as weed control, we've got water retention, and there's loads of studies. I've read quite a lot of scientific papers about woodchip mulch. I wouldn't have believed there were quite so many out there. Loads of research has been done around irrigation. A couple of ones that sort of stuck out for me was one that showed a 25% reduction in the amount you need to irrigate. If you've got a mulch on, it makes sense, holding in more water, you don't need to irrigate as much. There was another one which basically increased soil moisture by 26% when there was a mulch. So there's sort of two sides of the same story. There's one, if you're using overhead irrigation or drip irrigation, you've got to be aware that the mulch will actually absorb quite a lot of water before it goes through to the soil. So if you are top irrigating a wood chip mulch, you need to really make sure that you give it a good enough soaking that the water goes down under the mulch. Otherwise, what can happen is the soil bit stays dry and all the roots actually end up going upwards into the mulch because they're looking for water. So just sort of understanding that. One of the big things that it can do, it can help reduce disease. So by having the wood chip mulch, it prevents the splash of soil back up onto the plant. And a green manure will do that as well, have a similar effect. So one box tree growers and really bad box blight, they put the mulch underneath and it almost eliminated the disease. And they think mainly reason for that was for stopping the splashback onto those lower leaves, but also creating a physical barrier between potentially sort of diseases in the soil and the plant. We found it really useful for protecting the soil surface and particularly areas of high traffic. Obviously on paths where you're walking, that's quite well known. We've used it on the farm, even in gateways where we're driving tractors through. And as long as you're not going through in sort of stupid wet conditions, we've found it really has protected that gateway. We haven't had flooding, so even sort of taking tractors through, it's worked. So that's the mulches. Oh, and the other interesting thing actually we found with the trees. So we planted a lot of trees and we initially had some quite bad vole problems. Where we've used wood chip directly on the soil, it seems to have deterred the voles. Where we've used a mulch mat, it seems to create this lovely little hotel for voles. And then if you put mulch on top of it, it's like an insulated hotel for voles. But where you put it directly onto the soil, I think it falls into their runs. It just seems to they don't like it basically if it's directly on there. So that was kind of quite surprising. And this is a bit of an accidental experiment. So this was planted in 2017-18. So the all, sort of December, January, February of that winter. All of these trees that you can see were planted on the same day. We pollarded a whole load of willow trees and chipped them, threw the chip over the fence, and I meant to go and then move the chip and spread it around all the trees, and we never quite got around to it. So the trees on the right had about a 2.5 foot mulch of wood chip, which I wouldn't recommend particularly, but those trees on the right are now 12 foot tall, and the ones on the left are about there, and they all went in on the same day. And that was the thing that really kind of made me think, bloody hell, there's something there. And okay, it was a particularly dry year, so I suspect the main reason was moisture. And willows are probably particularly prone to drying out and not growing well, so the ones that had the mulch. But even so, I was quite struck by the quite how different that was. Normally you would definitely not have the mulch right up to the trunk because it can cause rotting. I think on willow it's not particularly a problem. So I did mention perennial weeds. Wood chip is pretty rubbish at controlling perennial weeds, particularly thistles, docks. Basically, they've got the power to push up through, and then when they get up through, they've got no competition because everything else is smothered out. So they've got this lovely clean bed. They've got lots of fertility and nutrition and moisture and all the rest of it. So that quite quickly turns into that, which is lovely food for the goldfinches, but might not be quite what you want, particularly amongst your vegetables. Yeah, don't try and control perennial weeds. And then the other bit is one of the things, particularly if you're looking at sort of scaling some of this stuff up, is how do you mechanize? We started with wheelbarrows and shovels and then sort of went onto trailers and manure forks. Definitely use a manure fork to move wood chip, not a shovel. It's much easier. But we're now looking at how we, you know, particularly we've got these long runs of trees that we're planting. How do we mechanize it? So the picture you can see there was done with a forage wagon, silage wagon. We just put the wood chip in instead of silage and ran up the side of it, and worked brilliantly. As long as the chip is even and doesn't have any rubbish in. So we have two sources of wood chip at Eastbrook. We make our own, so the willow, for instance, that we pollarded, but we also get some delivered from a couple of local tree surgeons, which is great, but it's, you know, it's different sizes and there's a log in there occasionally, or chainsaw helmet, or a, you know, pruning saw, or, you know, stuff that gets forgotten, and the farm manager would be pretty unhappy if we put that through his forage wagon. So you have to be pretty sure that it's clean before you put it through. There are specialist bits of kit as well. Well, the bottom right is not a specialist piece of kit, that's a load-all, but it's one way we, you know, rather than going back and forth to the heap every time, we just dump piles around the field, and then we can just sort of place it around trees as we need to. Or, you know, there are specialist side discharge machines. There's Seymour's in the UK. I think there's a couple of manufacturers that do it. These two happen to be American versions. There's front loading sort of turnip spreaders that you can sort of drive into the heap with, and there's an auger and it pushes out the side. So there's various sort of bits of kit that are available. They're quite expensive, some of them, particularly the sort of really specialist stuff, which is why we haven't invested in one yet. But doing it on any scale, I think, you know, spreading wood chip, even you know, around a couple of hundred trees, can take quite a while if you're doing it out the back of a little trailer. So, but you know, there's a lot of evidence showing, particularly on trees, showing the increase in growth, as you saw, you know, with that accidental experiment, but also increase in yields. So it more than pays for itself in terms of quicker establishment, quicker fruiting, and bigger yields. So although it seems expensive to have to sort of hand mulch trees particularly, I would say it pretty much always pays off. So once you've sort of got the benefit to the plant, I guess, it's having an effect on the soil. And obviously Silver already mentioned the, you know, the mushrooms and the worms. I'm going to do exactly the same, talk about mushrooms and worms. Wood is mostly broken down by fungi. It doesn't have a high enough nitrogen content for bacteria really to be able to get a hold in it. They don't like, the lignin is a really tough material that bacteria struggle to break down. So certainly most of the initial decomposition of wood chip is done by fungi. They can function at lower levels of nitrogen. And, you know, which is why even, you know, if you see a heap of just pure old brown wood chip, it will eventually break down and decompose. You know, although it will speed up if it's got more nitrogen in, you don't need it to break down. So that's an advantage in terms of, you know, just being able to leave it and let the fungi get involved. And it also plays a little bit, Adam was talking about the aerated, you know, static composting piles. If you want the fungi to break down your compost heap, your wood chip heap, it's best not to turn it, because fungi don't like being disturbed. So it'll actually, you know, you might want to turn it once or twice, but you don't want to be turning it all the time. They actually like to be able to stay put and get the hyphae going. The other risk, though, which is sort of one of the big things that comes up when you talk about wood chip, is the nitrogen robbing. So the risk of effectively the wood chip sucking nitrogen out of the soil to enable it to break down. There is some risk of that. What tends to happen is it will happen in about the 1 centimetre of soil that's touching the wood chip. So if you're putting it on as a mulch, then actually you're only going to be affecting the top 1 centimetre of the soil, probably. So for anything deep-rooted, so for trees, it's fine. For deep-rooted plants, it's fine. If you've got very shallow-rooted plants, it can be an issue. So we had a challenge on raspberries where it seemed to be just, the raspberries were too shallow-rooted, they weren't coping. So in that situation, we were mixing in manure with the wood chip to sort of counteract that and speed it up. The one thing you don't want to do is to dig in uncomposted wood chip. That's when you'll really see massive nitrogen robbing problems, because effectively every bit of chip is then next to lots of soil and will be sucking the nitrogen out. But if you compost it first for a year or 18 months, then actually it's probably not a problem to dig it in. So it's sort of understanding how you're going to use it and what you need it for. The other thing it will do, of course, is the more wood chip you're sort of gradually adding, the higher your fungal levels of the soil will get. So you're helping to shift that sort of bacterial fungal ratio of your soil towards the fungal side. But as both Sylvia and Adam said, it's not something you'd want to do every year all the time, but it works really well, as a mulch or as a starting point for bringing in ground that hasn't been cultivated. And the other thing, just from a climate change point of view, is fungi has this incredible ability to sequester carbon. It's as good as sequestering carbon as trees are. So you get the carbon in the tree, but you're also, if you're building up fungal levels in the soil, you're helping to build your organic matter. I'm nearly there. We've got worms as well. I mean, this what I found really interesting. This is from a wood chip pile on a concrete pad, so it's not got soil underneath it, and you can see that it's not even that broken down, the wood chip, yet. There's still a lot of uncomposted bits, and already the worms are moving in. So they came in actually quite quicker than I expected, which surprised me. This is not really a sort of organic farming conference slide, but it just shows the power of it. This is a bioreactor in the States that's being used to reduce leaching from nitrogen fertilizer from an intensive arable crop. Now, of course, none of us would have that problem from the crop, but it's kind of a slightly mad solution to, why don't you just put less on? Anyway, but I just found it interesting that they seem to think it was worth putting in a big pit of wood chip in order to capture runoff from the soil. And then you'd have to, every 2 or 3 years, you'd have to take that wood chip out and replace it with new. Raymond Woodchip. So Raymond Woodchip is it's wood chip from branches that are less than 7 centimeters in diameter. So it's young wood. It's higher in nitrogen. So it's got a higher nitrogen carbon ratio. The evidence seems to suggest that you can spread it directly on the soil without causing nitrogen robbing problems and with soil health benefits. There's only been 2 sort of main studies as far as I know. There's a whole load of stuff done in the 80s in Canada, and then there's a WOOFs project that I mentioned that ORC did, which finished last year. That's the sort of density you're spreading it on. So it's not, it's not a big mulch, you're spreading it sort of relatively thinly. The potential advantage is it's a really great way of using hedge trimmings or, potentially coppicing, your own willow or hazel or whatever. If you've got some short rotation coppice, you can just spread it directly on the soil. You don't need to take it away, compost it, bring it back. So it's a much easier way of incorporating organic matter and potentially boosting your soil health. There is lots more about wood chip that we don't have time for. So that's Fred with his hot box. We've got squashes growing in wood chip on the top right. We've got propagation compost, which that's taken at Tolly's place as part of another innovative farmers field lab. And then at the bottom, using it on no dig, as in a similar way that the other guys have described. But yeah, lots of ways to use wood chip, of course. Thank you.
Great. So we've now got about half an hour for questions and discussion, which is great. We should get our teeth into it. So are there any, first of all, direct questions? You can either make a question directly to one of the speakers or to them all, or just raise a comment that you want to discuss any further. So please, now I can't see anything because of that lamp, but I think there's a question down here, yes.
Oh, thank you very much for those fascinating talks. I just have, yes, Rebecca Lawton from the Landworkers Alliance and a grower in Somerset. I was interested in asking Ben about the energy balances in terms of using fossil fuel to chip up wood chip. in relation to the carbon sequestration, because presumably there's some CO2 emissions from the fossil fuel use. And have you done any calculations, or has anyone else?
I don't think they have, is the short answer. My gut feeling is that more will be sequestered than you'll use, but I don't know is the short answer. But yeah, it is a good question.
Thanks.
But I didn't actually, one question I wanted to ask, did you actually talk about how you chip it?
No, I only had 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, but is it generally chipped on farm then? Well, obviously it is produced on farm.
I mean, it really depends, I think, is the short answer. So there's two main sources, there's the waste from tree surgeons, which obviously, is going to happen anyway. And so that becomes, in the same way that the mushroom compost, is a sort of waste stream. And then there's a question of whether you're then creating your own and chipping it, where, it would be chipped on farm. And there's lots of different options in terms of, size of machine and method of doing it. You can do it smashing it up with a sledgehammer on a concrete pad if you want to do it slowly. And, so yeah, there's, as with anything, it gets more complex as soon as you get into it.
Great. I've actually got a question here that's coming on the chat, so we could take that. It's also on wood chip. Should wood chip from different tree species be favoured or avoided or treated differently?
Yeah, good question. So the broad one is around conifer and deciduous, and the general, depending on what you're using it for, but generally up to about 30% of conifer wood chip seems to be fine. If you get more than that, it tends not to break down so quickly, or, particularly if you want to use it for propagation compost as well. There are some specific problems with some specific tree species. So walnut, for instance, has juglone in it, which is an allopathic, potential allopathic substance. What seems to happen is that after about 3 months of composting, all of these things sort of get deactivated and disappear. So my understanding of the research is that mostly, as long as it's composted, you shouldn't have any problems with anything. But if you're using them really fresh, you have to be a little bit careful. But you could potentially use that as a positive thing. So, with the willow and the salicylic acid, you have to apply it fresh because you want the salicylic acid to go immediately down into the roots of the tree. Whereas if you leave it to compost, it all gets leached out and then it doesn't do that bit. Or, if you want to control weeds, it could be that the juglone and the walnut wood chip is good at inhibiting germination. So you actually might be an advantage. But I think there's very little research has been done on single species wood chips. And I think there's probably masses that we can learn, with the different ones there.
Right, there's another question here to the right.
Kate from Real Seeds in Pembrokeshire. Could you just talk a little bit about how the wood chip is composted for making the propagation compost, like how long for and how much it's turned and etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really going on Tolly's experience in this because he's, as far as I'm aware, he's the only one that's sort of really done it from pure wood chip, and it's just turning it. It's quite simple. He puts it in a heap. He puts his veg packing waste in as well. So it's got a little bit, but it's very little. It's mostly wood chip. And then he just turns it a few times, I think 3 or 4 times during the season. In a windrow. And then the bit that he's using for propagation, he'll compost for another 6 months or so afterwards, and then sieves it. And I think he then adds, a bit of perlite and vermiculite and biochar potentially, but I don't think you necessarily would need to. That's about the structure. And certainly the trial we did with him, it compared. There was very little difference between that and the leading peat-based propagation compost in terms of performance. But it's quite a sort of low-tech, simple process potentially. Although Tolly does make a lot of things look easy. So.
Right, any other questions further down the room? Anybody else use either green waste compost or spent mushroom compost that you would like to comment on? There's a question or comment here at the, yeah.
Thanks. I'm Tom from Eastern Market Garden in Scotland, and we have brought in green waste compost that's of marginal quality, I suppose I'd say before, in terms of like plastic contents and things like that. I was just wondering, especially to Adam, like, have you done anything to sort of improve, other than just leaving the compost to sort of mature a bit longer before you use it? Have you done any other things to try and improve it before applying it? I'm thinking of like mulching the pile with like bulky organic matter and things like that. We've experimented a bit of that, putting seaweed all over the pile and then tarping it and leaving it for a season just to activate it, because I'm sure, as you know, anyone who's touched that stuff, it can be very lifeless and scary. But yeah, just any experience from that would be great to hear about.
Yes, it's a good question. No, is the simple answer. I just kept piling it at the side and just letting it sort of rot down a lot more, and then just inspecting it in the future to see if I could add it, and then sort of, I guess, mixing it with the new compost that was coming in. So look, half a barrel of that with the new stuff to try and get rid of it. But it is tricky when it arrives and you're like, what the hell am I going to do with this? Yeah, obviously the site I manage, there's not a lot of trees where it could be mulched in the same way, like fruit trees or other sort of crops that we could do, as sort of Ben has been saying, because it was pretty much just wood chip. But no, I've not experienced of adding anything to remedy it, so sorry, no.
Can I just follow up? Did you find any big differences in the quality of the good green waste compost that you could source or buy in compared to the compost you made yourself? From the what would you say the differences in quality were?
Yeah, I'd say the compost that was made on site is a better quality. It's definitely, I think it's got more nitrogen in it, and I think that is because it uses a lot of veg waste from the shop, right, whereas green waste is largely sort of council waste. So there is
basically,
there's a lot of grass clippings or green matter and all sorts of stuff, garden waste. So it was a better quality making it, much better quality when we were doing the aerated piles, but that was quite a complex system to manage. But even just sort of tipping it in the piles and putting it in a large holding bay and letting the worms manage it for a year, as I'm sure Dan's saying, it is a better performing compost, and that used to get used on the top of the site, and the crops do better on that top bit compared to the bought in stuff. Yeah.
What about weed content? Was there any difference in? Did you get which one? Where did you get most weeds?
You get a lot more weeds in your homemade compost, but it's not always. Sometimes a batch of green waste can come in with lots of like red shank or something like that. So there are risks.
Okay.
Obviously, with bringing it in.
Got another question here in the front or in the middle.
Hello, Richard Plowright from Somerset. I'm just interested to hear what everybody in the room thinks we should do about green waste compost, because like a lot of people, I've used it. I've got about 30 tons in my yard actually at the moment, and I don't really want to put it on the ground, to be honest, but I've got to do something with it. I'm just wondering what people think, whether it should be prohibited.
So I didn't quite catch that. Whether green waste compost should be.
I'm just putting it out there. Whether green waste compost, which I've spoken to a few people today who say that they've got plastic-free compost. I don't really believe them, but I just think they haven't found it yet. So I just wonder whether it should be prohibited in the organic standards or not.
Okay.
Just a thought.
You would like to comment on that?
I don't mind starting. I think it's a massive issue. The Soil Association used to certify some green waste composters, and they got so concerned about the quality that we stopped certifying the composters. we still allow, you know, as the other organic bodies do, we still allow it to be added to organic land. And I think there are, you know, as Adam was saying, there are some good manufacturers. So I think it's about us helping to push the standard up. And one of the things you can do is you should be asking your supplier for additional information, you know, about the product. So they have a legal responsibility to provide more information if they want to sell to you. I mean, they can just turn around and say they don't want to sell to you. You know, so asking, you know, make sure you ask for the readouts, ask for as many, you know, ask them to make sure it's aminopyralid free, or, you know, ask them for plastic contaminant. I mean, they may not tell you, but if everybody keeps asking them, they'll start thinking, oh, maybe we need to do more about it. And the other bit is to get the PAS 100 standards improved, but that's,
Yeah,
you know, I mean, you know more.
Yeah,
about this than
and there
I do
are
now.
still specific standards, I think, for compost, green waste compost destined for use in growing media, which is higher standard, isn't it? So that's what you could be referring to. I mean, I think there is still a proportion, a very low proportion of plastic still allowed, but it is lower than it is for the general compost. So at least that's the standard we should be reaching for, or asking for them to produce.
But I do remember seeing a microscope picture of green waste compost with lots of microscopic bits of plastic in. So I think you're right, even if you don't always see it in there, it doesn't necessarily mean it hasn't got plastic in it. No, you got any other thoughts?
Yeah.
Now, I've got a whole long list of chats here. I'm not used to this, having to chat with chat. So I think there's a question here from Mick to everybody. I think there's a consideration if you're registered organic, and I'm not sure what that relates to, whether it sort of hasn't come in, perhaps in relation to the use of compost, or how much imported material you have. And then there is also another question from Holly, a trainee from Oxton Organics, keen to discuss the use of cover crops and other extensive and their extensive benefits as a way of reducing reliance on mulches as a no-dig market garden. Oxons have been moving away from the high input system of adding compost each year to focus more on using green manures, undersowing crops with diverse mixes, and ensuring roots are in the ground year round. This can protect the soil, increase organic matter, build soil health and biology, as well as to support biodiversity. So, yeah, I suppose it's promoting a different approach of promoting soil health using cover crops. So, anybody else want to comment on that?
Sorry, it's Kate again from Real Seeds in Pembrokeshire. Can I turn that question around? I don't actually use green waste compost, and I never have done for largely pragmatic reasons that I haven't really got any access and I don't know where I'd get them from. But can I turn the question around and say, if we all stop using green waste compost, where does it go? What happens to it? Because, you know, all this compost is gathered from households, so it has to go somewhere.
Landfill.
But my question is, what do we think should happen? No, I mean, I know that is what happens to it, but if we don't think we should be spreading it, what do we think should be happening? Do we think it should go to landfill, or do?
Anyone want to comment on the use of green manures or a cover crops as an alternative approach? I've got somebody who seconds all his views. We are trying to do the same, so there's obviously keen interest in that. Anybody want to comment on it further?
I mean, I suppose it's the whole closed loop question, really, isn't it? And obviously the green waste that's being produced is not being dealt with where it's being produced. And also if we're bringing in things to our sites, we're not closing the loop there either. So whether they're sort of bigger scale closed loop systems or they're micro closed loop systems, as it were, that connect to others, I think that's the question that we're asking. Like, where can we close the loop? So obviously, green manures, if you can grow and then save your own seed, for example, then you've got your own supply of mulch. The green waste that we're collecting in from other places, from other people who aren't then composting their waste, I don't know, I just see it a little bit differently as a really big systemic problem, but doesn't necessarily answer it. But yeah, for me, it's just closed loop and encouraging more composting and green manures, I guess, really.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear from someone who does use green manures or a vegan organic approach, if there's anyone here.
Anybody want to comment on that? On the use. So yeah, there's a comment there.
I was just going to say, it's Rebecca again from Landworkers Alliance. I was just going to say, I've actually had a lot of trouble with getting green manures established. And I've tried, I mean, Perennial is really easy to get to germinate, but other green manures, I've sometimes felt like I was just standing there and scattering money in the wind, because you buy all this seed and then you spread it, and it just, I've had so many failures with green manures that, I mean, I'm really wanting to do it, but I think it is quite challenging sometimes, whereas spreading compost, you at least know you're getting the compost and you're spreading it, and it's a bit more straightforward. The other comment I was just going to make was comparing composted green manure to green waste compost. I've just found there's just so much more life in the composted manure. And I used to be growing on a farm, mixed farm, where I could get access to manure. And it was just so much better quality. And I did use green waste one year, and I found it was not very good at, it was very hard to get it wet. It was really repelled the moisture. So I would go for composted animal manure personally, if it's a sustainable source and you can get it.
Okay. Okay, we've got a, I was just going to say, is it Francis I can see at the back there? I sort of see him a bit as our green manure king. Have you got any comments to make on how green manures could be, cover crops could be used, or perhaps combined with the use of other organic amendments? What would be the benefits? There's a microphone coming. I'm not going to let you.
Yeah, can you hear that all right? Does that work?
Yes. Close to you.
Yes, I mean, they can bring all sorts of benefits, fixing nitrogen, adding organic matter, competing with weeds. And I suppose the contrast, well, it's slightly contrasting or contradicting what Rebecca said, is obviously you do only need a packet of seeds. You know, there's no bringing in great sort of lorry loads of green waste compost or moving compost about. It is kind of compost grown in situ, so that as long as they grow properly, that's a good thing. I think it's important, you know, maybe to treat them as a proper crop, to make sure that, you know, that the seed bed, you know, you can't just throw the seeds and everything's good. You know, you've got to consider, you know, is soil appropriately cultivated? Maybe you need to think about irrigating them or timing the sowing of them so that they fits in with the right water conditions in the soil, things like that. Choosing the right species for the right time of year and the appropriate duration, all those sort of things. But yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot going for them.
Great, thank you. I think there was a question right at the edge here, so perhaps when you come up with a microphone, we'll catch that one there. Thank you.
When I read up on no-till in America in 2 books, I'm surprised that they nearly all are put on the layers of compost, but only some of them are following up with a cover crop, which surprises me. If you are a till grower, you've got to do the cover crop over the winter unless you've got a winter crop. But I was surprised that the no-till people in America, they don't all do the cover crop on top of the compost over the winter period.
Mm.
I mean, I've done cover crops in a till situation. I mean, it was essential. You can't leave fields bare. I mean, that's what conventional farmers do, isn't it?
Mm.
Particularly the people growing maize for cows.
Okay. So there's a question here at the front as well, yeah.
Yeah, this is going back a bit, but someone was saying about closing the loop and everything. I think as long as there are cities, there'll be green waste compost, if you see what I mean. Or you don't have to go back very long when household green bin collections were complete fantasy and pie in the sky and something that didn't exist in this country. So in a way, the existence of municipal compost is an improvement. It's just, I wish I could remember who, but I was chatting to someone who said that we're about 30, 40 years behind the green waste quality that they're doing in parts of Europe. It's just, we seem to be doing it really badly. But I don't want to defend it too much, but its existence isn't a completely bad thing.
Yeah, no, I think I probably would agree that there is a lot to be done to improve the quality of green waste compost. And it seems a little bit like we've sort of given up to get it cleaned at source, which is obviously what needs to be done. I've got to give these people here a chance as well. And I've got a follow-up on from Mick to everyone with regards to the restrictions within the organic standards. And it's actually related to the use of wood chip. So do you think are there any restrictions on the use of wood chip with those who are organic?
I mean, not as far as I know, not specifically. I mean, it's a non-organic material, so you have to sort of treat it in the way that you would other things coming into an organic system, and so that there are things within the standards about how you treat non-organic inputs, but it's not specifically about wood chip. And as long as it's just from an untreated, tree, so obviously don't use, I sort of almost went without saying, but don't use old pallets and treated wood. If it's from a tree, then it's fine.
Okay, and there is a similar question along a different amendment, but also with regards to whether it's suitable for use on organic farming system. And that is from Jonathan at Haven Hills Field and Kitchen. And he's asking, is 1-year-old farm composted horse manure not certified allowed for use on an organic farming system? Ben, you are certified?
I think so. 1-year-old
horse manure that doesn't come from an organic source, I think.
Yeah, there's also additional standards around GM feed and making it sure they've got a declaration of they've been fed non-GM. I mean, I'm personally a bit suspicious of horse manure. They tend to be very heavily wormed and, yeah.
And can be a lot of problems with aminopyralids as well, residing in horse manure. So
it depends,
be a bit careful.
Depends on the horse.
Oh my God, I've had a long question here now, but I'll wait a little bit for that. If there are any more questions from the floor. Oh, we actually got lots. Great. There's a chap there. Oh, sorry, there's a question behind you first. I'll come to you next.
I'm going to shift gears a bit. Ben, you kind of mentioned briefly about the ratio fungal versus bacterial dominated compost. And I guess it would also apply to mushroom compost potentially. And this is kind of emerging as a field of research or not. I'm just curious because this is being talked a lot about, particularly like David Johnson, Chico State, and talking about fungally dominated compost with Johnson soup bioreactors and the rest. Can you expand a bit more on what are we talking about when we're talking about fungally dominated versus bacterial dominated compost, and what are we looking for?
So, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on this, but my understanding is that as soils get older, they become more fungally dominated. So, as you start on a, volcanic larval side, the first things that come in are bacteria, and then you get your young plants, and they quite like bacterial dominated soil. And as the progression comes in and you get bigger plants and shrubs and trees, they prefer the soil to be more fungally dominated. The more we cultivate soils, the more we kill off the fungus because they don't like being disturbed. So that you end up reverting back to a higher bacterial ratio in the soil. So trying to redress that balance a bit. Most of our cultivated plants prefer it a little bit more fungal, is my understanding of it.
Anybody else want to comment on that? And then there was a.
If there are any mulches that slugs don't like.
Concrete. I mean, old wood chip, they're not that keen on, but basically as it starts breaking down, then they'll move in. So it's a temporary thing.
So I'm just going to insert with a question here from the chat. It's a question to Ben. Do you know if you can use the bokashi system to compost wood chip? We are currently using a front loader to turn our pile, but are interested in a less machinery intensive method. Not sure whether effective organisms are compatible with fungal based approach. So can you use a bokashi?
I don't know is the short answer. I'm very sorry. I need to put that
Look
in
into
second
that.
edition.
It's more of a bokashi is more of a bacterial decomposition. It's a fermentation process.
But if you don't want to turn, then actually, you know, using a static aerated system would work. You know, if it's the turning that's the problem. But I honestly don't know about bokashi.
And then I've got a comment here from Ed Sweetman from Gnown Growers. I'm struggling a bit with the term waste product. So I guess that relates to, well, I suppose either spent mushroom compost or green waste compost. All inputs have value, and if things are grown specifically to provide a waste product, there's a problem with ghost acres. Also, if every grower is after these waste products, there is clearly not enough to go around. Therefore, it's neither a waste product nor sustainable. This is especially important if the waste product comes from a non-organic sources. So I suppose that was relating back to the.
And I guess it's the reframing of how we use this, essentially a waste product. And I think by the fact that I can't get hold of mushroom compost, it's not a waste product anymore.
Can you hear that?
Can you hear that?
Comment here. That probably have to say that again.
By the very fact that we can't get hold of mushroom compost easily now, I guess qualifies it as a non-waste product because people want it. But it's a very good way of looking at it, actually. And that it's not created as a waste product; it's a byproduct of another industry, and therefore it has value, I think.
We'll end up with a crazy situation of, you know, producing artificial fertilizer as the waste product because we need CO2, you know, that's the kind of.
So are there restrictions on using spent mushroom compost in organic under organic certification?
I mean, again, I don't think specifically, I think they all come under this, you know, materials from non-organic systems that have a sort of set of guidance around them. So
yeah, but do they have to be recomposted before use?
they have to be composted or stacked.
Yeah, from what I read, it's to do with the components of mushroom compost rather than the mushroom compost itself. I don't think there's anything specifically on.
I don't think so.
I think it's to do with the gypsum that goes into it and the lime, and it's sometimes as a capping layer of peat. Some growers take that off before it goes into the composting or as in spent material. So I guess it's the components rather than the compost itself that comes under the scrutiny.
Okay. And I've got an answer here rather than a question. That's from Neil Marshall. As a mulch, compost much better than woven fabric as far as slugs are concerned. The woven fabric seems to suit them just fine. So that we have got an answer to the slugs there. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, we got a question there in the guy in the blue there. Yeah. Has anybody tried use of wool as a matting?
Somebody in a previous session said that they'd used wool on a very small scale as a mulch, and it suppressed the slugs, they said.
Yeah, you could certainly get. There was a time when you could get wool pellets for certainly for a gardening scale. There's another question there in the middle. Yeah. No, yeah. Can you see it?
Just wanted to say wood chips being commonly used for pathways has become really popular for that. My own experience of it is that it goes bloody everywhere. And I was just wondering, when you said about direct contact with fresh wood chip can rob nitrogen, what kind of level, you know, when you're walking along a pathway, I mean, I avoided small pathways and I found it okay for the big ones, but I just wondered, like the scatterings, will that directly affect it, or how bad does it need to get before it really starts to affect fertility?
I mean, because there's sort of a number of factors at play, so it will depend on how old the wood is and how big the wood chip is. So the bigger the wood chip is, the less contacts and effectively you've got, so the less problem there is. The younger the wood is, the more nitrogen content it's got, so the less risk. And the more composted it is, the more it will already have broken down. And it's, you know, it's a temporary thing as well. So obviously it takes the nitrogen in, but then as it rots down, it releases it again. So it's usually a problem at the beginning of the process. If you're then putting another layer on or another layer on, then it will be absorbing that anyway. But I would say it's mainly a problem if you're digging it in. You know, that's the big thing not to do. But if you're worried about it, then compost it first, basically.
I just realized that we have run 5 minutes over. Are there any still another burning questions that you don't want to go home until you've asked that question? So no, or you would like to have a tea break? Well, thank you very much for attending this session. And I think we should all thank the speakers. It's been really interesting to get into a good discussion about different types of organic amendments and how we make the best use of them. So thank you very much for all attending, and let's have a break. Thank you.